Stanley Druckenmiller was at Bloomberg Invest Conference yesterday. Every single time Stanley Druckenmiller talks, you should listen. He's one of the single greatest investors in Wall Street history. He has compounded capital at more than 30% every single year for 3 different decades. Now, Stanley Druckenmiller had a lot to say, and he started out talking about the debt. Currently, the United States debt sits at $31 trillion. It used to be at 15. But Stanley points out that actually the true debt is almost $200 trillion instead of the $31 trillion number that everyone talks about. Here's what Stanley had to say.
The debt went from 15 trillion to 31 trillion over that time. That debt, and this is important because most people don't understand it, assumes there'll never be another Medicare or Social Security payment made. That's
200 trillion is the present value as you've calculated for the students.
Not me, credible people, Larry Kotlikoff and others. If you assume we're never going to have another Social Security or Medicare payment, the debt is 31 trillion. But if you did your accounting like any corporation and you assume those payments are going to be made, yeah, the present value is probably around $200 trillion.
Now that commentary by Stanley is obviously sobering, but he had a nice little joke where he started to talk about the fiscal gap. And as he points out, it's an absurd idea that only economists could come up with. The fiscal gap is something that we have to continue to pay attention to because it says that taxation is not a path towards actually balancing the budget. Here's what Stanley thinks about this.
Only economists could come up with this term. It's called fiscal gap. What is fiscal gap? That's how much you would have to raise taxes today to guarantee the benefits you've promised seniors in the future. It's 7.7% of GDP. What does 7.7% of GDP mean? To actually pay for the entitlements we promised in the future, you'd have to raise all taxes 40% today, forever, or cut all spending 36% today, forever. What I'm looking at here is this stuff is borrowing from the future. You're going to crowd out private investment. You're going to crowd out the kind of investment that made us a leader on all those kind of things.
Now, as many of you know, I listened to another interview that Stanley did, and he suggested to read the book, The Price of Time by Edward Chancellor. I read it, and it's a fantastic book that I also highly suggest that you go read. Here's Stanley talking about what he learned from that book, which goes all the way back 500 years and looks at various asset bubbles and then is able to connect the asset bubble to a period of easy money beforehand. When we have asset bubbles, they always lead to economic chaos and catastrophe. Here's what Stanley has to say, looking at today's current environment.
Because the question I have for you there is, do you believe that there are still many shoes to drop as the central bank stays tight?
That's my central case. I deal in the world of risk reward. There's a 500-year history of asset bubbles well documented in a book that you had some issues with, The Price of Time. And basically, it documents, and I had already known this about the last 100 years, but it's going on for 500 years. Every time you've had a significant asset bubble, economic trouble lay ahead. But yeah, when you had 11 years of free money, people do stupid things. All you have to do is look it up there. But the stupidest is somebody paid $80 billion for Dogecoin, which was invented as a joke. I mean, that can only happen in the world of free money. It also suppressed people worrying about the kind of stuff I just talked about 2 or 3 minutes ago because you keep rates at zero. But the fact that this was arguably the most disruptive economic period we've had since the late 1800s, and there were no bankruptcies, apparently they've started in the last few weeks, tells me there's a lot of stuff under the hood when you go from this kind of environment, the biggest, broadest asset bubble ever, and then you jack rates up 500 basis points in a year. I think the probabilities would suggest that Silicon Valley banks, Bed Bath & Beyond, they're probably the tip of the iceberg.
It's interesting to hear Stanley talk about all of these different points. I tend to agree with him. We obviously had an asset bubble in 2020 leading into 2021. The Federal Reserve has done their absolute best job to go ahead and destroy demand using their language. But they've done a better job at destroying investor demand than they have consumer demand. And so if the Fed has already tightened from 0 to 500 basis points, and they may continue to tighten, likely the bubble will continue to be deflated over time. Now, how bad it can get, I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. But what I do know is that you've got to be prepared You've got to have a strong balance sheet. You've got to try to optimize for cash flow, and you have to be optimizing for optionality at the moment. Don't go out and make big purchases. Don't go out and sink all of your money into any one investment. Instead, the name of the game is going to be resilience over the coming 24 months. I think Stanley Druckenmiller is ringing the bell. There's plenty of people who think the worst of the pain is behind us. As he said, he and his team believe that there's another shoe to drop. And I tend to think that the probability is increasing every single day that he may be right. If you haven't listened to the full interview, he did it with my friend Sonali Basak over at Bloomberg. I highly suggest you go listen to Stanley's full commentary. He's always a great listen, and I always learn a ton every single time that he speaks. In conclusion, Stanley Druckenmiller is saying what many people have said for decades. This time is not different. Don't get too cocky. Don't get too arrogant. Don't start to believe that it is. Because if history is our guide, asset bubbles come, but asset bubbles go. And usually portfolios get hurt.